Hello. Welcome back to the study of the book Following Jesus, Discipleship in the Gospel of Mark. In our study of this book, we are tracing the unique message of the Gospel of Mark, the message about discipleship. In our first three sessions, we have focused upon the first half of Mark's Gospel. In that section of the Gospel, the disciples are blind. That is, they do not recognize Jesus as the Messiah, and they struggle to understand what he teaches. In this session, we move from the first half of the Gospel to the second half of the Gospel. In the second half of the Gospel, the disciples can see, just not clearly. They are like the blind man who needed a second touch in order to see clearly. In this portion of the Gospel, we come into the heart of the biblical writer's teaching about discipleship. In chapters 8, 9, and 10, the biblical writer strings together a series of stories that contain the heart of his teaching about discipleship. Each of those three series begins with the teaching by Jesus about what he will suffer when he gets to Jerusalem. The disciples struggle to understand that, but more than struggle, they actually resist and reject what he is saying. Out of that struggle and rejection, then, comes a teaching from Jesus about the meaning of discipleship. Now, the dividing line between the first half of the Gospel and the second half of the Gospel is the story found in chapter 8 of the blind man who required a second touch in order to see clearly. Immediately after that story in chapter 8, Jesus took his disciples north of the Sea of Galilee into the mountainous region of Caesarea Philippi. These mountains provided the headwaters that fed the Sea of Galilee. Jesus took his disciples there on retreat. And there he asked them what they were hearing. What were the crowds saying about him? And they gave what they were hearing, Elijah, one of the prophets. But then Jesus asked the question, but who do you say I am? When you're talking about me behind my back, who do you say I am? And it was Peter who gave that statement that we have come to call the Great Confession. For in response, Peter said, you are the Messiah. You are the Christ. The word Christ meaning is the Greek form for the word Messiah. You are the Messiah. Oh, now they see. But they don't see clearly. Immediately after that acknowledgement that Jesus was the Messiah, the scripture says in Mark 8:31, then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Now that they have the understanding and recognition that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus seeks to build upon that foundation. He seeks to tell them what it means to be the Messiah. He seeks to communicate the understanding that was reflected in his baptism. You remember that in his baptism, it was affirmed that he was indeed the Messiah. But it was also affirmed that he was the servant of the Lord, the suffering servant. Jesus understood that to be the Messiah, the Messianic King, was to be a servant who would end up suffering. And so as he was trying to teach his disciples about the suffering that he would encounter in Jerusalem, they had a hard time grasping that. For the scripture says that Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. It wasn't that they didn't understand, like in the first half of the gospel. Here Peter understands clearly what Jesus is saying, but he resists it and he rejects it, and consequently he rebukes Jesus. See, Peter is still thinking out of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, that merit-based thinking that creates this hierarchy in the world. And in Peter's mind, in the disciples' mind, Jesus as the Messiah was going to be at the top of that hierarchy. There was no place for suffering, much less death, in their thinking. When Peter rebuked Jesus, Jesus in turn turned to him. Verse 33 says, "But turning and looking at his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, 'Get behind me, Satan.'" The word Satan there means adversary, a stumbling block. Peter, you're not acting like a disciple who's following me. You're actually pushing against me. You're opposing the very thing that I'm attempting to do as the Messiah. He went on to say, "For you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." The reason Peter was resisting what Jesus was saying was because he was thinking the way the world had trained him to think. From the leaven of the Pharisees, the leaven of Herod, that merit-based thinking that allows us to divide the world into us and them and creates a hierarchy. Jesus says, "Peter, you're thinking the way the world trained you to think. But you're not thinking from the ways of God, and you're not valuing what God values." Out of that interchange, then Jesus begins to teach what it means to be a disciple, the first of three teachings in chapters 8, 9, and 10. Here we find the first of those teachings in chapter 8, verse 34. "And so Jesus called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, 'If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me.'" You're familiar with these three statements. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Here Jesus is saying this is the heart of discipleship. This is what discipleship involves. But what do those three terms mean? I want to suggest to you that if we are to understand those three terms, we must interpret them in light of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. We must interpret them in light of how the world trained us to think and function. Jesus said, "Take up your cross." A cross, as you know, was an instrument of execution used by the Romans, but they reserved that form of punishment for a select group of people. The cross was used to execute insurrectionists, those who dared to defy the power of Rome, those who rejected the ways of Rome. So when Jesus said, "Take up your cross," Jesus was saying, live as an insurrectionist. Jesus was saying, reject the way the world has trained you to think and live. Don't buy in to the world's ways. Reject them. And in rejecting them, then follow me. The term take up your cross carries the idea of here's a foundational decision that we make and then we live it out. It is a one-time decision that we then live out. But the term follow me is an ongoing process. When Jesus called Peter and Andrew, James, and John, he said, "Follow me." When he came to Matthew, he said, "Follow me." The term follow me was a technical term used by a rabbi in enlisting disciples, a teacher enlisting students. And so Jesus was saying to these 5 disciples, come, enter a relationship with me and let me teach you. Learn from me. Be my disciple. So to follow Jesus then is to learn from Jesus. It is to be his follower. It is to be his disciple. It is to be his student so that we're learning what he taught. When Jesus said, "Follow me," he was saying that discipleship meant that we were learning from Jesus a different way of thinking and a different way of living. We were learning from Jesus the ways of God. And as we learn the ways of God, our thinking then becomes shaped by the character of God, the nature of God, and the ways of God. What Paul called the mind of Christ. So here Jesus says that to be my disciple is to consciously reject the way the world trained us to think and live and embrace a new way of thinking and living, the way that Jesus taught. A thinking shaped by the character of God and the ways of God. But notice there is a third statement. Deny yourself. And it too relates to the thinking, the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. You remember that merit-based way of thinking emphasizes obeying the laws and conforming to expectations. It focuses upon behavior. It engages in rigid right and wrong, black and white, either or thinking. That merit-based thinking allows us to divide people into us, them, those like us, those not, those who measure up, obey and conform, and those who don't. It allows us then to engage in comparing and competing. We compare ourselves with those who don't measure up the way we do. And that comparing and competing then leads to this better than, less than thinking in which we look down upon with criticism and judgment of those who don't measure up or those who don't keep the law. And that creates this hierarchy, this way of being better than others. And in this merit-based way of thinking, we use our power down against those who live beneath us that we consider less than. This whole system of thinking produces an egocentric identity. It produces a false persona. This persona that we created based upon who the world said we needed to be if we wanted to be valued and accepted. I call this constructed self, the constructed self. It is an egocentric identity based upon self-effort, accomplishment, and achievement that makes us feel better than others. The phrase deny self is talking about that constructed self, that egocentric identity. To be a follower of Jesus is to deny self. It is to refuse to engage in the comparing and competing games of merit-based thinking. It is to reject the better than, less than thinking. It is to surrender this persona that we have so diligently worked to create so that we would be valued in the world's eyes. To deny self is to be willing to abandon our identity based upon who the world said we had to be. Deny self. Reject the egocentric identity. Take up your cross. We reject that identity because we reject the world's thinking. Follow me. Because we are learning a different way of thinking. A thinking shaped by who God is and by the ways of God. Now Jesus drove home that kind of thinking with what he said next. For those who want to save their life will lose it. Those who want to protect this egocentric identity, this persona, this constructed self, those who want to protect it will actually lose who God created them to be, and in the end actually lose that constructed self. He goes on to say, now those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will find it. When we're willing to turn loose of that egocentric identity, that persona, that constructed self, as we pursue living the ways of the kingdom, what we will discover is who God created us to be, and we will actually save our life. We will save that who God created us to be. Jesus went on to say, For what will it profit of someone if they gain the whole world and forfeit their own life? What will it profit if they reach the top of that pyramid, that hierarchy? What will it profit if they gain all of that status and standing and prestige and power and affluence, and yet lose the very essence of who God created them to be? To be a follower of Jesus is to reject the world's way of thinking as we pursue learning a different way of thinking and living. And in that process, we surrender the egocentric identity. Now, this teaching is reinforced in what we call the Transfiguration experience recorded in chapter 9. 6 days after this teaching, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and went up on a mountain with them for a retreat. In this retreat, the 3 disciples had a vision of Jesus. Well, we call it transfigured. It's as though a veil was pulled aside so that they could see beyond the physical realm into the spiritual realm. And they caught a glimpse of the glory that Jesus would enjoy after his suffering. In that vision, they also saw Moses and Elijah. Moses represents the prophets. Moses represents the law. Elijah, the prophets. The law and the prophets was the term used to refer to the Hebrew Scriptures. So in this vision of Jesus as the glorified Messiah, they are being taught that what Jesus is teaching about the Messiah is reflected in their Hebrew Scriptures. That Jesus is Messiah is taught in the Scriptures. That Jesus is the servant is taught in the Scriptures. That the glory that Jesus would experience would come after his suffering is taught in the Scriptures. As they were experiencing this vision, they were enveloped by a cloud. And in the Hebrew Scriptures, a cloud represented the presence of God. And so in this retreat experience, they experienced the presence of God. Out of the cloud comes a voice. In other words, God spoke to them. The voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved." You will recognize and remember that phrase. We first encountered it in Jesus' baptism experience. It comes out of Psalm 2, the coronation song. And so what God is saying to the disciples is, guys, you got it right. Jesus is indeed the Messiah. But then the voice said, listen to him. The voice said, quit resisting, quit rejecting, be willing to learn. Think outside of the way the world trained you to think. Well, in our next session, we'll explore the next 2 teachings about discipleship, one found in chapter 9 and one found in chapter 10. And those 2 teachings build upon this first primary teaching. So as we come to the end of this session, take a few moments to reflect. If you're in a small group, take a few moments to discuss among yourself. What is your understanding of the phrase, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me? How does this new understanding, this different understanding, challenge you? What are the implications of it for you? Where do you have leftovers? That is, where do you find that you're still hanging on to the way the world trained you to think, that merit-based hierarchical thinking? And where do you find yourself still protecting and holding on to that egocentric identity? Hanging on to the way the world trained us to think, hanging on to our egocentric identity is just a normal part of the spiritual journey. Look at the disciples' experience. They see, but not clearly. They needed a second touch. And so part of our spiritual journey is recognizing those places in our life where we resist and reject the teachings of Jesus. We rationalize them away because we're still living out of the way the world trained us to think. We're living out of that egocentric identity. It's important that we recognize these places in our lives so that we can do what God said to the disciples. Listen to him. Well, I look forward to when we gather again for our next session and we look at the next two teachings in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 9, chapter 10, about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. These next two teachings build upon what Jesus has already taught when he said, deny yourself, take up your cross, follow me. I look forward to that time together. Until then, I pray for you the peace of Christ.